Yes, people, and we're live. Welcome to the chat. Welcome to our show. I'm joined by 86 Boxing, Josh City from 86 Boxing. What's up, brother? Oh, I'm not hearing you at all, Josh. You muted?
What's going on, Random? Appreciate being here. Another edition of the Prime versus Prime matchup. So I'm looking forward to where this discussion takes us because it is some big matchups.
Yes, indeed. Hey, folks in the chat, let us know if our volumes are comparable. For some reason, my phone is playing Josh's audio quieter than normal, and I want to make sure that we don't do all this talking for naught. Just let us know in the chat if you don't mind if the audio is acceptable as far as what's coming through on your device. Well, Josh, this is part three. We've done some interesting matchups so far. I think our next matchup we have right here on the screen right now, the great Joe Louis on the right, the Brown Bomber of the 30s and 40s, and the great Muhammad Ali. Oh my goodness. What a matchup. Josh, just start riffing, man. What is this? How does this strike you, this particular stylistic clash?
This is one of those that is a true classic in the sense of the word. It's one that will have people bent, turned in different shapes. Their mindsets will vary, etc., because it's one of those matchups that boxing just in history and just individuals who have followed the sport for longer periods of time, they are keen on and they have an interest for because of the fact that it is two of the mega heavyweights that you can actually match together. And in most people's regards or their own list, maybe that's heavyweights list or pound for pound heavyweights, even just in general, their favorite fighters, you will often find these two, one or two, two, one A, one B, etc. Any way you slice it, when you think about the two greatest heavyweights of all time, you will, in all likelihood, see these two on that list. There are many who are pretty steadfast in their belief that Joe Louis is number one. And by that same token, you have just as many who would apply that same claim to Muhammad Ali. So it gets very interesting when discussing these two and especially matching them up in a fantasy style. And I believe that there's probably no right answer, just as there's no wrong answer, because it's such a polarizing matchup. And the two of them just evoke a high amount of thought, a high amount of interest when discussing heavyweight boxing, or at least just boxing in general from a history perspective. It's a tough one for me as well because I have fond respect for both of these individuals, great figures for the sport of boxing. Each had significance in their era, even though they weren't far off from each other if you think about it from some of the other heavyweights we tend to talk about in history, but each had their own significance and there were some parallels in terms of some of the things that they were dealing with at the time. As mentioned, there are a lot of racial parallels. There are differences in how each of them approached it, so it just sparks all types of conversation just when thinking about the two of them. Joe Louis, he was a figure who really was a true bright spot for the community and participated in what may be, and I tend to think, the most significant fight in history in that second matchup with Max Millings, just given the implications of such and what was going on at the time. A story that I'm sure many have heard on numerous occasions, but also you take Muhammad Ali, and he became a figure in his own right for the community. His refusal to go to war and being steadfast in his religion and being willing to give up a portion of his career, his prime, in order to make sure that he let it be known to all who would listen that He was a man of his word and a man of his beliefs. And this made both of these individuals just premier, historic, high mark figures across the board, not only just from a sports perspective, but also icons globally. It was that type of reach, two huge, tremendous figures just globally. And interestingly enough, Joe Louis would be someone who would spend time with Muhammad Ali. You'll find pictures out there of a young Ali and Joe Louis. And certainly you have to think that there were probably things that were said, conversations that were had that may have just directly aligned with this same conversation we're having as far as who would do better or who would win if they were to be matched up with each other. And I'm sure each of them were I'm sure they were each pretty confident in their own abilities. And I do know that they also respected the history aspect, the history of the sport, etc. In a similar capacity, Lewis had to go through something of a similar nature with Jack Johnson as he retired and of course became that figure, and Lewis was the next in line. So it was one of those, so many parallels there. And you can't tell the story of boxing without these figures, and that's across any weight class. So to the crux of why we're here, of course, the matchup in itself, very, very tough. I know I've said that before. I mean, it probably doesn't get any tougher. And this is just one of those that will evoke a certain type of thought, a certain type of response. And I'd imagine there will be those that will agree with some aspects, maybe none. And there will be those who will be on the same side as I, and then those complete opposite. Now, just thinking about it and how they stack up, of course, not too far off just from an overall weight perspective of them fighting in their top shape, top prime. Uh, you could see both of these guys just over 200 pounds. We'll say Ali 215. We'll give ourselves a 205 Joe Louis or something of that nature, though he certainly could be one to get down below such. But both of these guys, they just kind of stack up tremendously well. Joe Louis being around 6'2", maybe more so in that 6'1" range, 6'1.5", somewhere there. Ali being 6'3". And I mean, the measurables are practically set for the two of them to just be the right type of stylistic clash for each other. Now, as far as how they box, we know that Ali was a man of the shuffle, a man who could move well on his feet. He could float in the ring. He would be like a smaller weight fighter as a heavyweight in terms of how he was able to pivot, shift. He was able to bounce around, change direction at any point, step in and out, step back with his hands down, the head movement to couple, and probably the fastest heavyweight we've seen in history. And that's thinking about it from a hand speed perspective, thinking about it as far as his feet, as well as just what he was able to do from a defensive standpoint. Just one of those true, almost mutants in the sense of heavyweight boxing and heavyweight history. This was someone you had to put together, create in a video game or something of that nature, because typically you didn't get your heavyweights with these types of attributes. You didn't get them as fast as Ali was. You didn't get them doing all of those unconventional things that Ali was doing. And by that same token, you look at Joe Louis, then he would be the sort of antithesis of that, considering he was everything that you sought in a heavyweight from a fundamental perspective. He seemed to just have all of those tools, have all of those attributes that, if you look at the annals of heavyweight history and you were to just kind of wrap all of the best traits of a fighter into one, then you could argue that Joe Louis met that mark because he was one of those individuals that just seemed to be built strategically and specifically for heavyweight boxing, almost a robot. Said all the right things, didn't didn't or he had more of a reserved type of personality and style. So he was someone that you could just get behind. Of course, if you're the powers that be in boxing, you could get behind him, show him the way. This is a fight. Joe Louis, the type to go in, do his job, and then it's on to the next one. Uh, Almost like a robot, as I'm saying, or the RoboCop before that was conceived. One of these guys who, I mean, just from a stylistic standpoint, was great at just measuring distance, being able to step in on fighters, track them down, cut the ring off on individuals, keeping himself right in line with where he needed to be on an opponent. We saw this on several occasions. He was a master of throwing those short hooks that would change the dynamic of a fight in any instance because they came with such precision, such accuracy that the power in itself didn't even matter because they were just landing the way that they were meant to be landed because he was throwing them the way that they were meant to be thrown. But we know him as one of those power punchers in the sport, just a heavyweight phenom in some sense. And he came at absolutely the right time as far as being the individual to follow Jack Johnson as the second Black World Heavyweight Champion. And he held the title in high esteem. He had a lot of backing. And he was one of those individuals who gave back in probably more ways than what benefited him, as we saw later in life. And so you think about the matchup of the two styles, then it's hard to not bring up, it's hard to not think of the stylistic look and view of each of these fighters and use that as a catalyst for how you would decide upon a matchup between the two. For instance, if you're a fan of the way Ali operated, knowing that some things weren't necessarily the way they should have been as far as fighting with his hands down, doing things in such an unconventional manner, then just seeing him, someone of his size, being able to operate in that manner probably blew you away. And it was probably one of these things that made you just latch on to Ali. And then you add in the boisterous nature of his personality and the ability for him to just engage with fans, engage with media alike, as well as get into the heads of his opponents with all of the talk, the antics, the rhythm and rhyme, then it's hard to take that out of your mind just when you think about Ali, especially thinking about someone matching up with him and defeating him, because with all of that in thought, he still went in and backed it up when he stepped into the ring. We got to see that front and center. And his first introduction to such was him taking out a guy in Charles Sonny Liston who was cerebral, a man who didn't speak much. You could say not unlike Joe Louis, not really heavy talkers, things of that nature. But Sonny Liston was one of those guys who, like Louis, packed a huge punch. And when the opportunity arose, he could finish fighters and we saw him destroy some opponents just with his ability to loop in those hooks and send fighters to the canvas. So there was an expectation that the same would be the case when he faced Muhammad Ali. And Ali overcame because, as he said he would be, he was a bit too fast. He was too sharp technically. And we got to see that come out when he stepped in there for what was the biggest fight, one where Meany didn't give him a chance. Meany didn't think that he would go the distance, and he had to overcome some adversity in that fight as well, with the situation surrounding his eyes and his inability to see for a couple of rounds there. So you had all of the talk, all of the bravado, but Ali most certainly could back it up. And I always go back to Muhammad Ali versus the likes of Cleveland Williams or Zora Fali to point to, just at least in my opinion, because these are opinions that we're sharing, just the absolute supreme version of Muhammad Ali, and the fact that I just felt that that version of Ali was one that I could see no heavyweight defeating during any period, just thinking about the history of the sport. And a lot of that was because of the way that he could move. It was just so graceful, the way that he moved around the ring. He was very economic with the punches that he threw as far as the amount. And when he was throwing them, the accuracy and ensuring that he was attuned to making sure it was the right punch for him to do what he needed to do to break down his opponents, especially that Cleveland Williams fight. Cleveland Big Cat Williams, who was one of the big punchers from that era at that particular time. And we've always associated heavyweights with being these big, strong guys who, of course, knocked out opponents. And that's what brought the fanfare. That's what people like to see. And the way that Ali went about doing such was different by comparison. So him breaking down a guy like Cleveland Big Cat Williams and many others that he ended up going through, that was essentially showing that there was a new type of heavyweight out there, and it was one who you could throw him in with anyone, and there's no question that you'd be hard pressed finding someone who was as fast and fluid in motion as him. And this was even lower weight fighters, if you take it from the perspective of when we think pound for pound, how fighters look, what the way they operate. And it just so happens Joe Louis has a connection to this. From my understanding, one of the reasons this came about was looking at it from the perspective of if Joe Louis fought someone like Sugar Ray Robinson, but in Muhammad Ali, it was essentially like a heavyweight version of Sugar Ray Robinson. And I know there was some inspiration there. So many tied certain inspirations or a fighter's epiphany or affection for a previous champion, someone of a previous era, as being their acknowledgement of them being greater. I do think a big piece of that is the respect aspect, and you likely won't hear anything different when asking certain fighters of some of their previous heroes, and Ali, him in a sense being modeled after Sugar Ray Robinson in some regards, just the way he was able to move in that ring. But I think when you think from a pound for pound perspective, you can take Ali, place him at any weight, and he's going to be effective because he was just different in that regard. So it's highlighted by the fact that he is or he was a heavyweight. And that makes it so tough when thinking about the likes of a Joe Louis, who we saw just go on an absolute complete run at heavyweight, 25 title defenses, There was a point where he was regarded as the greatest boxer in the world, and this was despite weight, anything of that nature being factored in. You thought about boxing and you thought about who is the best boxer. It was just Joe Louis, and then everyone else, because he had that type of effect and appeal on the sport in itself. And then just to see how he was able to operate in the ring, break down opponents, and his ability to cut them off, and just maintaining the line, that straight line, zeroed in on an opponent, keeping the body where he needed it to be, keeping him right in front of him in most cases. Now, he had situations where there were some speedier opponents that he ran into, and some of them had some success at points. You think about the likes of a Billy Khan and so forth. But when it came down to it, when he was 100% focused and on edge and determined to get a fighter out of there, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who could come in and deliver the level of brutality that Joe Louis was able to deliver. And you think about him cornering a guy like Ali somewhere against the ropes and teeing off, you have to think that it's going to have some type of major effect on the body of Ali, maybe slow down that movement over the course of a fight. And slowing down Ali is probably the best bet in terms of being able to gain that victory over him, as we saw in the case of his fight with Joe Frazier, the fight of the century. Now, mind you, this was Ali post that initial version that hadn't that initial version that went through the situation with the Vietnam War and all. But what we did see was that Ali, he started out on his feet as typical, and showed that, hey, he still had movement, but eventually the relentlessness of a Joe Louis continued to come through as he kept charging forward, kept pushing Ali back, kept landing to the body, kept being able to get those hooks off. And if you were to kind of weigh that against Joe Louis, you could argue that Joe Louis would probably even land with, or would probably land with even more precision if he were able to just continually get to Ali over the course of a 15-round contest, which this would be in all likelihood. Now, Ali has shown that he was the type of individual who would have the mettle, he would have the heart and the chin in some sense to be able to withstand such by any means. So we wouldn't see him stop. And when the going got tough, or when he did slow down, as we saw even later in his career, and couldn't move in the same fashion that he could, then he was willing to exchange. He wasn't known as a knockout artist or anything of that nature, but he still had enough pop and precision on his punches when he zipped them in to be able to effectively do damage. And despite him not being known as a knockout artist, getting knockouts was not a huge issue for him, because he was able to get it done, oftentimes through attrition. And you just think about Ali just never giving up, him being able to withstand such, and continuing to be in the ear of an opponent, as I'm sure he would most certainly be in Joe Louis's ear throughout the contest, saying a ton of things, probably some nasty things, probably things that you wouldn't want to play on the radio, or play or put in these videos, things of that nature, just to make sure he could gain that edge by any means. And I suspect Louis wouldn't stoop to that level, but Ali, there wasn't anything that he was unwilling to say to be able to get into the mind of an opponent. And I think that would play into the contest in itself. Louis being someone who could likely take it all, but you have to think that some things might play in Ali's favor as far as that concern, with the two of them being there in ring at that particular time. It's hard to conceive either of these individuals being stopped, knocked out, especially with them being focused, just thinking about the two of them together there in the ring. But if that were going to happen, I would probably lean more towards the blazing fast speed and punches and precision of Ali, or at least the way he zipped those punches in, those straights just coming blasting speed, super sharp. I would suspect that those would be blinding in some sense for Joe Louis. And the stronger puncher of the two, most certainly Joe Louis. If you're thinking about who had the big punch and the potential for that one punch knockout in itself, then I would aim or lean towards Joe Louis in that sense. So, but with all of that in mind, I would think that it would end up being a fight that goes the distance. And I think that Ali will have done work in the early rounds to distance himself a bit and prepare for what would come later, which would be the raft of Lewis and the inside work, inside game, all of that. But I think in those early rounds, through the first portion of the fight, Ali would be on his toes. He would be bouncing all over the ring. He would be at a distance where Lewis himself probably wouldn't be able to get off his shots in the manner that he would later in the fight once he closed the distance a bit more. And I just think the speed would be a major factor between the two. And that could be interchangeable in terms of who'd gain victory on any given night. There are varying scenarios for which this could go in a series of fights. I have no doubt that it would probably be in a similar capacity to when we saw Ali in series of fights where there's some closely contested fights. Just thinking about Ali Frazier, for one, that's probably at that high level the one that we can most tie and associate with this. So I have no doubt that the two would match up in a way that it would be grueling, tough, and probably close to death, as Ali himself once put it in relation to that third fight with Joe Frazier. So I have no doubt that it would likely be a typical or similar type of scenario were he to be battling it out in the ring over 15 rounds in multiple stints or multiple fights with Joe Louis. But in that single fight, I'll give Louis the edge, or I'll give Muhammad Ali the edge. But in a series of fights, we could see the dynamic change, and it could change for Louis on forward. You know, it's just that type of matchup. When the edge came, it could change the dynamic at any point. But super tough. I still feel that this is, just my opinion and some thought behind it. It's hard to dive into it completely. I mean, we could dedicate an entire show just on this matchup alone, and we'd still probably be no closer to anything definitive as we would have been before the show in itself even started. But for the sakes of course, we're on we're on certain time constraints. I go Ali decision if the two were to match up, maybe even razor thin in some regards. But I think that early work will be what leads him to that point.
Wow, interesting points, 86. Very nicely done. I've just been in the background. Sorry, I haven't been engaging with the chat, y'all. One, it's time constraints. Also, I've been in the background here, like making graphics on my other phone, uploading them. Because like it's kind of thrown together. I work nights. I didn't wake up that long ago. This is a crazy matchup. I mean, to me, this is the top two, strictly at heavyweight. This is the top two of all time. I rate the great Sam Langford 3. Even though he has a larger heavyweight resume, I just think strictly at that weight, Ali and Lewis. Lewis was the most dominant of the three. I mean, when he was at his best, he was crushing. Ali fought in a richer era, so even though he did have the occasional loss, it was great fighters. And Langford had the toughest overall heavyweight schedule of the three. But he didn't have the same numerical success for a variety of reasons. But I think with this, I mean, you're talking about one of the great punchers of all time, or two of the great punchers. One is probably the greatest combination puncher of the big men, Muhammad Ali. When he's, you mentioned like the Williams fight, but there was a lot of fights. When Ali decided to let it go, it's really something to see. Like if you watch back the fight with George Foreman, he had Big George in trouble in the fourth. They even said it on the commentary, like because it wasn't like he waited till the end of the fight to start punching back. No, that was his whole thing. He messed with you, but then you're taking punches, trying to land bigger punches, and it affects the adrenaline when he's taunting. Now, I don't know if he could rattle a young prime Joe Louis, who was he was able to play the role of a reserved fighter. You know what I mean? So I don't know if Ali's going to be like, oh, look at you, this and this. I mean, Louis, he was holding himself together. He was very professional. Jack Blackburn, I think partly seeing how the public had responded to great Jack Johnson, his flamboyance, to get his opportunity, Louis had to beat great opponents without ridiculing them or rubbing it in because they didn't want to bring up the echoes of Johnson, even though that was decades earlier. So Louis did get his opportunity, and he was always on balance. So Jack Blackburn taught him the old school style, the shuffling style with that sort of almost a side stance. Sometimes even like I don't know what you would call a low long guard. Your lead hand isn't always up by your face, but it may be extended from your body. But Louis had power from short distances. He had that, just like Sam Langford had. Jack Blackburn saw to it to guide his natural power to give him the ability to punch with short power and from any position. It's a tough one for Ali's body, I think. But we're talking about the Ali at his best. He had so many ways to get out of danger. Louis is going to bring the danger. I think both guys are going to get roughed up in this fight. I think at the beginning of the fight, Ali with his rhythm and his just, he's in there. He's a jazz musician, and I think the early part of that guitar battle that Ali's going to take the early rounds, but he is going to take some big shots. And there's one of the clips of Louis. You see him send an absolute right hand laser to the body and a right hand laser to the head. He drops the guy hard. It's like Louis wasn't slow, and he could unload in combos. And he did fight some great fighters who came up from the lower weight, which Ali did as an amateur. My understanding is Ali was not a career amateur heavyweight. He got bigger as he got older. Louis fought some guys who were world class and faster because his power was an equalizer. Even if it took longer to catch up, or with Billy Conn, you need a combination of factors to let him catch him late in the fight. But I think the early rounds are tough. So if it's a 4-round bout, it's Muhammad Ali 4-0 If it's 10, 12, 15 rounds, I think this is a very close fight. And I don't think, because of Ali's ability to move, I don't think Louis stops him. Neither of them were in the finish fight era, to my understanding. So we're not thinking about that. So if they fought in each other's era, I don't think there's too much difference in the rules, and maybe the gloves are slightly different. So, but I think the larger gloves, if Ali's era, if they were using puffier gloves, that favors Ali. But the punching of Louis will come through in anything. It was a technique. It was a technique thing. Jack Blackburn had this dude so well honed that you got to look out. So he is going to reach Ali's body. If Liston can reach his body, the great Joe Louis can reach his body, 100%. He was faster than Liston. He didn't have the reach of Liston, but he was faster than Liston. He was a better combination puncher. He was, he wasn't as big, but he was much better in that realm, thanks to Blackburn's guidance, and also the fact that he was always a beast of a puncher who then acquired great technique. So he's like a self-taught musician who then went to a conservatory school, and learned the craft, having already some of the natural attributes. So, yeah, I think it's tough, but Ali's, the jab and his adaptability, I think he's more adaptable than Louis. His style isn't as safe, though. Louis was a great hooker, and I think the way Ali used his upper body to get away from headhunting, Louis didn't have to headhunt, but when he did, he was pretty quick to come upstairs. And he didn't have to go like left, right, or right, left. He could go right, right, or double taps with the left. So he wasn't like some simple game of Tetris for a brilliant fighter like Ali. So I do think this one is a real tough one. The question is, how many times does the tide turn during the fight? because Lewis is going to find him. He's going to find him in the body, and a couple times he's going to get that hook or that cross to the chin. Ali can roll like no one his size ever could. So at least as far as a tall guy, Sam Langford's rolling and using the top of the head to block. That's a different stylistic clash. But Lewis, yeah, man, he was just good all around. Both of them were basically at their best. They were both arguably the best in the sport. They just happened to be heavyweights. So yeah, I think it's a close 15-round decision. If I had to call it, it might be so close that in their, it's a bit of a cop out, but it might be so close, Josh, that in their own era, I would just very, 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 very slightly favor them, but only by a couple percent. You know, like negligible amounts of favoritism in their own eras. I think it's a really close fight. I don't think I can call it. I don't think I, but Ali had a more layered game. And when in doubt, like with Fitz and the great Archie Moore, a more layered game, the ability to fight in the abstract to some degree. It's just that Lewis was one of the group. Just he's not fighting a normal guy. He's fighting a perfectly honed Terminator. The great Joe Lewis, the Brown Bomber. So the power, it's like every time you do get caught, you're not getting caught by like these big lumbering guys who wind up like, no disrespect, but like Foreman, the way Foreman, who was a tremendous puncher, you look at the way he punched compared to Lewis. Lewis had that short power. He didn't have to punch with the left, and then the back is coming from outer space. The right hands come from outer space. He could ding, ding, ding. Very vicious and fast enough to catch smaller guys than Ali, or the guys who are naturally smaller frame than Ali. So, yeah, I think it's too close to call. They might even fight in a 10-rounder. Maybe I favor Ali because I think he's going to build up points early, but he is going to get caught and he is going to slow down. And Lewis had rib breaking power to the body, and was one. And Jack Blackburn was brilliant. He had Lewis. So there was rarely a fighter in history who was so perfectly tuned to destroy in the heavyweight ranks as a prime Joe Lewis. So, before the Schmeling fight, like if Lewis, like I said in one of the other matchups we had Lewis in, if he's dropping his hand after the jab, he's going to pay for that. So pre-Schmeling loss Lewis, maybe I favor Ali. But once he tightened that up and further layered his game, yeah, that's too close to call. So I'm just gonna sit on the fence, but maybe very slightly favor Ali if the gloves are puffier. Yeah, I think that's where I'm at, Josh. What did you favored Ali, right?
Yeah, I favored Ali, and I do think that, man, there's some compelling points that will be made on the side of Lewis. There are compelling points that have been made on the side of Lewis. And, it's hard to argue against that either. I think this is one of those, it can just go any way at any given time. I lean on Lewis here. Someone might have something that kind of compels me or even changes my mind in some sense that leans more towards Joe Lewis. You never know. That's happened before as well. But yeah, I do lean Ali. I'm there with you. But that is no slight to the great Joe Lewis. I think this is just one of those matchups that you can flip a coin at any given time. It can land on either fighter. That is rather. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And doing this up, I was trying to brainstorm it a little bit beforehand. There's so many ways the fight can go, but I just think it goes back and forth, and it's absolute war. They're both going to be all jacked up after this. Lewis is going to eat so many combos, but he had the style. He had that style, like you see, like Rocky Marciano kind of patterned his style. It looks like after Lewis, like a little bit of side stance, take the sting off the punches. It also acts as a natural wind up to come in with big shots as the guy comes forward. You're leaning back, bing, bing. Lewis did some of that. Lewis was he was a terror, but it's hard to count out. At his very best, Muhammad Ali was something extra special. Like,
yeah, and
spine tingling.
Certainly. And Surrealist, shout out Surrealist in the chat. Shout out to Flack, everyone in the chat there. Dan, salute Bruce Gas, everyone. But Surrealist made a good point. What if it were a 20-rounder? That could change the dynamic a bit because Lewis had some 20-round bouts, and just thinking about him being able to get in that body work in the later stages of a 20-round contest. We're talking post-round 15. Then that could be a big game changer in a sense. So just so many compelling things that can be thrown out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, 20 rounds. Yeah, Lewis, the body, the longer you have to, they're inevitably going to slow down. But a body, you know, I think it was Langford was credited for saying you can't, you know, your head can duck, your body can't, you know, so you can get to that body. Lewis knew that. Blackburn knew this. This is like the older style, especially when the gloves were very small. You know, you don't want to ruin your hands on someone's head. You work the body, and then when they're not bracing, they're tired and they're wounded to the body, the hands come down. That's when you take it upstairs. Both fighters understood this, though. Ali was a good body puncher, too, and hyper competitive. So Lewis might do something. It might be that Ali, even if he can't like throw Joe Lewis completely off, he can start messing with him a little bit, just a slight bit. I don't think to the degree he could other fighters. Joe Lewis was incredibly tough mentally. But yeah, maybe there's just small, tiny, you know, tiny edges, like Texas Hold'em players, like the poker players. You know, they're dealing with these minute edges. Oh, if I do this, or if I look up at him before I do a certain thing, maybe that shoves it 0.25% in my direction, like predicting what he'll do. So yeah, what a fight. You want to move to the next fight? Because I've almost given up on trying to pick between them. I think maybe Ali at his very, very best. It's not a
Yeah.
longer fight. I think maybe it's fair to favor him. It's just Lewis was so deadly. It's hard to that's the thing about these all-time great matchups. Neither of them ever fought someone just like each other. Or themselves. You know what I mean? They were kind of one of a kinds, and we're matching some of these all-time great fighters with one of a kinds. Like with Archie Moore and Fitz. There's only one Archie Moore. There's only one Bob Fitzsimmons. So it's hard to draw from. It would be hard for these guys to train for each other. Ali couldn't just go find someone who's as good as Joe Lewis, and Lewis couldn't find anyone who moves like Ali at that weight. So yeah, that's a tough one. You wanna So if we're gonna move to the next one, let's see. How about you know what? You wanna keep we did okay, so we did Langford Ali, we did Ali Lewis. So I'm not sure about for you, Josh, but for me, you know, we're tossing around the top three heavyweights of all time. So why don't we go to this right here? Why don't we do Langford Lewis? Let's round out the top three. We wove Jack Johnson into the mix. I have him as the fourth. So maybe we can work him in next. But let me change that banner. My fault, folks. I'm not very good at controlling all this stuff. There we go. Josh, your thoughts on this incredible fight right here?
So yeah, this is another tough one. One I haven't actually put a lot of deep thought into just previously, but certainly a very interesting matchup for a litany of reasoning and two big punchers. Just thinking about the history of the sport, contrary to the amount of fights and length of his career and where he started, Langford did put in a great deal of work at heavyweight. And that's probably the weight in which he really stamped his name into the legacy books, given his feats and what he was able to do, being more on the undersized end of the heavyweight division. And I think that plays well into this matchup and why it's one of interest and one that will, a lot like the previous, have varying opinions, especially given that Langford would be facing in Joe Lewis, one of the more popular heavyweights in the history of the sport. So many compelling things that would lean or that would lend to you leaning either direction. We can think about Langford, some of the contemporaries he ended up going up against during his era. Just so happens that some of them are some of the greatest heavyweights to have laced them up overall in the history of the sport. You think about Joe Jeanette, who is one of the underrated heavyweights we've seen in history, doesn't quite often get the name recognition as Langford, even by comparison to some of the other contemporaries of his time as well. Solid guy who stood about 5'11", somewhere in that range. Could be a very, very stout and cut, 200 pounds, or 200 plus pounds, on his best day, and someone with an excellent jab and long arms to who would try to offset the shorter Langford coming in, working from that jab. And we actually have one video of the two going at it that is out there on YouTube. Another contemporary, of course, Sam McVeigh, essentially the Mike Tyson of his time, a guy who, when the two of them first fought, this being Sam Langford and Sam McVeigh, Langford was giving up 41 pounds, which is insane to really think about it. But still, he was able to hold his own and gave Sam McVeigh hell. And McVeigh, as mentioned, a guy who stood about 5'10-ish, 5'11", and he was a very comparable fighter if you look between eras to Mike Tyson. So just think about this bulky, stout guy, Langford, going up against him. Another one was, of course, Jack Johnson, though they only fought once. We know the story of Jack Johnson, the Galveston Giant, former world heavyweight champion. But Langford, even when he was a smaller fighter, went up against him and held his own, had some great moments in that contest. And he was giving up weight, which was often the case with Langford, and yet it didn't faze him. And that was a part of his journey, just thinking about going up against a heavyweight like that. And Jack Johnson, who we know to be one of the great defensive specialists we've seen in the history of the sport, especially heavyweight division. You'd be hard-pressed finding anyone who rates higher, but also he was just one of these, or he's a magnificent sort of just name and just figure in the sport of boxing, given what he was able to do. So this is someone that Langford went up against, in addition to Harry Wills, another one I want to name because he stood about 6'2", 200 plus pounds, big, strong, heavyweight, who Langford early on was able to handle in some bouts with almost relative ease, you could say, and he was able to stop him as well. And Harry Wills would go on to be one of the greatest heavyweights that the sport has seen. And he would have his success sort of on the back end against Langford, who was at the tail end of his prime during this particular period. But I throw those names out there because those are some of the greatest ever. And all of those guys would match up well in some capacity with Joe Louis, who many regard as the greatest heavyweight ever. So you think about that and how Langford fits into the fold, then Langford very much would be a player in a contest with Joe Louis. And I think he showed such by virtue of what he was able to accomplish in competing with the guys I just previously mentioned, some of them with whom he fought well into the double digits as far as the amount of times he stepped into the ring with them, gaining a crazy amount of wins, a high amount of wins over these competitors of his. And I think some of the things, some of the traits, attributes, etc., that he brought to the table in those contests would be some of the very same that would help him in a contest with Joe Louis. So Langford, who was at about 5'7", had a long reach. He was pretty stout, had a large upper body, wide shoulders, broad chest. He could pack a punch, and despite giving up size, he was stout enough that he wasn't an easy guy to just handle and move around in the ring. As a matter of fact, I was watching the Bill Lane fight at least the clips that are available of that contest last night. And one of the things that was apparent is when he got into exchanges that were heavy with Lang, Lang couldn't help himself but grab Langford. But I don't know that he was the stronger fighter in that contest, despite the fact that he was bigger and he had the size aspects, measurables on his side in that contest. And he outweighed Langford, I'm guessing somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 pounds, but I don't know that he was the stronger fighter. He struggled even when clinching and grabbing Sam Langford. So I think any individual going up against Langford wouldn't be going up against the typical 5'7" sub 200-pound heavyweight. And I think that matters. We've seen in some instances, or I guess you could say many instances, where great small fighters have gone up in weight and become great at some of those higher weights. And that's no different with Sam Langford. For whatever reason, through all the trials, the tribulations, through all the fighting, the contests, the 300 to 400 or more fights he had over the course of his career, it helped him to be able to handle size in a pretty straightforward manner. As far as the video footage that we have of him, size wasn't one of those factors that prevented him from being able to get off his offense and land the shots that he needed to land when he could get them in. And I think it would be no different as it relates to being in there with Joe Louis. The size wouldn't be a fear for Sam Langford. Joe Louis, who we were just speaking about in the contest with Ali, he would find that Langford would be someone who would be there and willing to exchange with him. And it would be a matter of how Joe Louis deals with what's coming back from Sam Langford. Now, Louis had some moments where he might have been caught stunned in some fights, even dropped in contests. So we know that Sam Langford, in theory, should have the power, or would have had the power, to be able to hurt Louis, potentially drop him, maybe even stop him there on, depending on at what point of Lewis's career this is. Certainly, if we look at Louis, who on the back end of his career, while still formidable, lost to another undersized heavyweight who was pretty relentless in the ring and had certain aspects and attributes, even intangibles about him, that made him take a diehard approach to any time he was in the ring, as well as the training that led up to it. Rocky Marciano, he eventually got to that version of Joe Louis. And I think that it's certainly conceivable that a Sam Langford in a similar scenario would have likely done something similar, or it could have even been done in a different fashion, but ultimately the same result. And I think that plays into it. But of course, that was not the absolute peak version of Louis. And that, in a sense, would make it a different story, even for the great Sam Langford. So I presume that, or I believe that this fight would be one that may be fought in the middle of the ring. I actually think it may be fought in the middle of the ring. Just, you see both of these individuals as two guys who don't necessarily back down in the ring. I would think it would be one of those contests where we might just see the two of them in the trenches going at it. Those huge hooks coming from Lewis, I think would do some damage on Langford. And by that same token, Langford, when he's able to tee off with his own, I'd imagine that would do some great damage to Lewis. Uh, or at least maybe I'm conceiving the style of fight that I would have liked to have seen. So that could be argued as well. But I see this fight taking place in the middle of the ring, neither fighter really being one who would want to back down, and both having their success. Uh, I think we see a lot of power punches in this contest, but because it just has the makings of one of those types of fights, just given the mentality of each. I'd imagine that both of them, they take a similar quiet cerebral approach to them entering the contest, entering the ring as they're walking up there, names announced, and when they disrobe and the bell is ultimately rang, I just see the two of them being there in the middle of the ring. And for a number of the things just mentioned, like some of the opponents that each of them went up against and what they went through in those varying contests, I think that both are most certainly built for that moment. And I think both are built for the magnitude of what would go down. And I think that there wouldn't be a ton to separate the two if they're meeting head to head right there in the middle of the ring. If anything, you might give more of the, I want to say, power edge, just given how he stacks up from a measurable standpoint to Joe Louis. And that's me thinking about dealing with Joe Louis on the inside would probably be similar to dealing with, in some regards at least, to dealing with Harry Wills on the inside, who was a strong, solid, sizable individual, probably a little bit bigger than Lewis in all actuality. But I just think, yeah, just dealing with an individual like that on the inside, it would be similar. Wills was one of those types of individuals who, yeah, he was just tough to deal with on the inside. His probably prime punch of choice being the uppercut, but landing in all likelihood with a similar type of precision with, or that would be akin to when Joe Louis was able to land his hooks from the inside. And of course, he can mix some uppercuts in with it. Now, and I mentioned to you that, of course, early in Wills's career, he struggled with Sam Langford, but he eventually was able to beat an older version of Sam Langford who, was more on the back end of his prime. So I think the age, time in which it's fought, that could certainly factor into this contest. But I do think that if you look at it even from just a prime for prime standpoint, assuming both are at their peak heavyweight prowess, I do think that Lewis would probably get the edge, especially if the fight is fought the way that I assume it would be fought, which would be the two of them on the inside just really going at it, batting down the hatches, and we're going to go mano a mano here for this. And that doesn't necessarily mean a wild or crazy fight, because both of these guys, they had the type of accuracy, they had the type of resilience and sort of a stealth to them that I think it would be just an impressive fight to actually watch or to have witnessed. And I would lean more on the Lewis edge, though I think it would be a decision. I don't see Lewis stopping Sam Langford because I think he's just too determined a fighter. And I think it would be just some of the size and some of the strong suits of Lewis and what he's able to do on the inside, even being the bigger fighter compared to Sam Langford, I think that would play in his favor in a similar capacity as a Langford versus Harry Wills, as I mentioned, who say the two of them were fighting with both of them being at their absolute peak would just be a hell of a contest as well that I think would play out in a way that some of the size aspects there on the inside would play into Wills's favor. You know, if we're talking about a one off for all the glory on a single night. But as with a lot of these contests in a series of fights, I do think that wins would be exchanged on both ends. But just thinking about, that single contest, both at their peak and the fight being fought where I had initially mentioned, I probably lean more on the side of Joe Louis picking up a decision in the long run in a hard fought contest that both feel the next day.
Yeah, they're definitely both going to feel it the next day. Yeah, good analysis there. Shout out to the chat. Good analysis, everybody. This is a tough one. I think as I initially thought about this fight, Lewis has mostly physical advantages. He doesn't have the same chest or shoulders. Langford was a unit in that sense, but he has height. I think he has a little bit of reach. I'm not sure what Lewis's reach was, but he's a big guy. He's a naturally bigger frame, other than his chest and shoulders, but like he's a longer frame, I should say. He was by the time Langford was weighing in at a prime Joe Louis weight, he was past his back. That was when he was a little bit out of shape. He was still deadly, but he wasn't like slim trim. The best version of Langford was probably like 180, 185 pounds. At that weight, apparently he just had such a combination of speed and power and experience by the time he got there. I think initially I was thinking, well, Lewis, I mean, dude, he could punch so hard. But then I started to think about, well, Langford fought hard two-handed punchers who fought in the style of Lewis. Like McVeigh's guard wasn't quite the same as Lewis's, but he did. A lot of the fighters that Langford went in with were the kinds of fighters that Jack Blackburn, along with his own expertise, learned from and drew from to craft Lewis into a killer. He was a throwback of sorts. He was an attempted improvement on a throwback fighter, and that's partly why he had so much success, because the fighters in Langford's era, you had to keep a schedule, right? You're fighting seasons. The newspapers are comparing guys' seasons. At the end of the year, they compare what kind of season everyone had. So you had to be able to protect your hands and not get bust up, because it would take you out of the action. It'd add up. You've gone back, to your pre-skill days. Start losing the craft. Langford was razor sharp at his very best. I gotta think he knows exactly what Lewis is doing, and though he hasn't fought someone with quite the same attributes as Lewis, who was phenomenal and a real bull and very strong, but it's like Lewis at his best wasn't as heavy as the later Lewis, who was still dangerous, tough fights, but Lewis at his best was actually a little closer to, he wouldn't have that much of a size advantage. He wouldn't be the heaviest heavyweight that Langford had fought by far. He would actually be closer to Langford's, or halfway from Langford to some of the mid-sized heavyweights. So, but I got to think that his experience in fighting that stance and his layers, because he could hit. They could both punch with both hands, but Langford could fight out of a square stance. You see in the Jim Flynn footage from 1910, he's posting off with one hand, right? And we see it in the training footage from London in 1911 for the Bill Lang fight. He's George Byers and Bob Armstrong. They're like leaping at him, and he's just posting off their chest with his hand, pushing him back, and then they switch out to keep him. So he's got like four guys in rotation just leaping at him, and he just pushes them back with each arm. You see in the Jim Flynn footage, he's able to just like post off his head or his shoulder and then land these monster uppercuts. And when after that, he's now in the opposite stance and he's going to do the same thing from both sides. So when he's fighting on the retreat, just in that little glimpse there, you can get just a touch of Langford. His ability to go forwards or backwards diagonally in a square stance and left. He wasn't orthodox, but he could fight left-handed, but he wasn't like certain other greats of the past. Like he was able to operate pretty dangerously. Like Tyson was like this, pretty dangerously from a variety of situations relative to the opponent's position. And I just think with Lewis, even though it's going to be a really dangerous version of it, I think he's just seen enough of that stance, especially at the lower weights. Guys who did fight like that in the side stance, that's how they take the steam off their punches. Langford, with his short head and his long arms, he loved to bring that right over the top, or laser right, when guys were leaning back. And he had longer arms than it seemed in the moment because of his height. He looks like a little dude, but his arms are like a normal guy. I think that's gonna throw Lewis off, and I think Langford's gonna win the fight. But I think it's gonna be in the late rounds, and it's gonna be a great fight. I just think it adds up. Langford had all those tricks that Blackburn taught Joe Louis, and he was the lead operator of some of those tricks in his own day. At his best, he was the guy doing what Jack Blackburn wanted Joe Louis to do, largely. That shuffling stance, that always in position, that the foot game, the angles of the feet. If you look at watch the Bill Lang fight in London, Lang's doing this. He's trying to move around the ring like Jack O'Brien, then jump in and throw and plant and throw. But if you watch in slow motion watch Langford's feet. Every step he takes, he's keeping his foot inside the other guy. He's winning the angles war with this economy of movement. So as the one guy takes 10 paces right to circle to the next corner, Langford gets there in 2 or 3. He just turns. He doesn't have to like reset into a bladed stance and then march forward. He'll go sideways. He'll march straight in ahead. And so he's very efficient in that way. Lewis did some of that, but I don't think Lewis could fight Langford from the outside. And as you know, Josh, if you look back at the record, the closest someone came to beating Langford by coming in was Jim Flynn in their second fight. The first one that happened in 1910, he'd already destroyed Flynn in a round in 1908. But apparently he found out he was making like a third of what Flynn was. So he's like, all right, this is the shortest fight you're ever going to see. And he just got him out of there, right? Destroyed him. They fought again in 1910, early 1910. Flynn got the best of a newspaper decision, but it was close. And a lot of people in the papers I see in California, they thought Langford was just carrying him to get a bigger fight, a bigger purse, longer rounds. They did fight again. I think it was scheduled for 45. He got him out of there, I believe, in 8. But you can see, and so the one guy who kind of was able to muscle Langford around the inside, there's a question as to whether Langford was kind of allowing it to happen. So Lewis would be fighting in a way that Langford would love for someone to fight. Come on in, have your guard, be ready with your counters, but don't bounce around. Don't fight me on the retreat. And it's like, so even though Lewis would be landing some hard punches, maybe knocks Langford down across the fight. I'm sure they knock each other down probably. I just think the experience Langford had in that exact mode of fighting that Lewis wasn't. Blackburn's one of his attempts to reimagine that early style. That's at least to my perception. That's Lewis, like Rocky, they were fighting in a more old school style, which is great because it takes a lot of defense into account. It's not like some of the boxers you'll just see they hold their hands up and then the guy hits them and then they punch back. But that means they're taking a lot of punishment on the guard. Now you go back when the gloves are smaller, it's harder to do that. You hold your hands up, they'll just punch you around the guard and the side of your head. So I think I think it adds up, and I think Langford gets him out of there late in the fight. I think Ali is a far tougher matchup for Langford than Joe Louis, because Ali fought nothing like anyone. Maybe Jeff Clark, great jabber mover, Joplin Ghost. Yeah, he was a jabber mover, but there's only one Ali. Joe Louis was a great version of a type of fighting that long predated his own life even. It goes back to the bare knuckle days and things. Hit the body, hard to soft, knuckles to the body. If you're going to hit the jaw, you don't need to bounce your knuckles off a guy's head. Hand wraps and gloves, that protects the hands. That's what that's for, not the head. So you don't destroy your hands. So I think it's tough, but Lewis was an absolute phenom, and he was beautifully trained. So he'd gone through the thing. But I think a motivated Langford who's not taking it easy, and maybe who knows who the opponent is and how he fights, I think he gets him out of there. Like round 14 or 15, right toward the end of the fight, he turns it up. He still has a bunch left. He has tremendous experience in long fight situations. Not all of his long fight bookings went the distance, but he had a bunch of bookings for 20 rounds or even more. Some of them, like the Flynn fight, I'm pretty sure that was like 45 rounds, right? California, but it went 8. But he had to at least conceive of a world where it would go that far. And then obviously you have like Jeanette and McVeigh in their great finish fight in 09. I mean, that's literally like there's no limit. Someone's going to relent or be stopped. So I think, in a longer fight, 20 rounds, I'd favor Langford because he did that at the highest level, at the Hall of Fame level. And in a general fight, I favor him a little bit, but not with certainty, because he didn't get hit by too many guys who could hit like Lewis with that combination of speed, precision, and power. And Lewis had that. He wouldn't have the advantage over certain other fighters who weren't that as connected to that early style of fighting, that shuffling style that Blackburn was so expert at. Blackburn got the best of Langford and Joe Gans in the same year. The same year that Gans held the lightweight title and that Langford had beaten Gans. So it's like Blackburn was a genius at fighting, and I think he'd be well armed. But I still think I got to favor the Boston Bone Crusher to get it done. I don't think Lewis was mobile enough to stay out of the way of Langford's power, and guys just as rugged as Lewis knew to stay out of his power. And I don't know that Lewis was like as much a clinch expert as Langford. I think if he did come in and try and tie him up, he's going to eat famously tough punches. I mean, Langford was like, he could wilt people with his body shots up close at any range. I mean, Lewis had some of that, but I just think Langford helped develop the style that Lewis was patterned after and the master. It'd be like having a guitar battle against Jimi Hendrix. You can study your Hendrix, you're not Jimi Hendrix. That's his thing that certain guitarists, like I guess if there's a music analogy there. So, I think I favor Langford slightly, but not by much. Any extra thoughts, Josh?
I thought you made some good points there. Yeah. I would say that, there was some good chat good conversations in the chat surrounding sort of the lower body aspect where, Lewis, who of course would have probably a little bit longer legs, but also muscular legs that allow for leverage. Same of Langford, who was stocky and solidly built as well. So just thinking about the torque in those punches that each of them is drawing out. So I do think that, it would come down to, the type of fight that is fought, because, of course, starting slow would favor either fighter or favor the opposite fighter. If one were to have started slow and then you just think about the back end of the fight and what those earlier rounds could mean for the contest as a whole, because I do think it goes the distance between the two. So those are just some things that are very compelling. I think you made some good points that would make one lean towards Langford, and it's tough either way you slice it, because we know that both of these guys were legit. Good points on some of the stylistic aspects that were around and just a major part of what made Langford stand out, that were sort of picked up and carried on in different heavyweights. So I just think it's a very interesting matchup. As a matter of fact, a lot closer than probably I would have thought, because there are just so many different scenarios that could alter things and change the direction of things in a way that would make one lean or lean a little bit in the favor of either fighter. I'm still of the mindset of a Joe Louis via decision, but certainly, man, there's compelling points made that help to further see how this would be an insane series of contests.
Yeah, it's a pretty spectacular matchup. I'm not too, even though I think Langford will get him out toward the end of the fight, like 14 rounds or beyond. You know, if they fought a series, I would expect Lewis to learn a lot of the tricks from the master, and to improve his results. So if they fought 5 times across their careers as prospects, actually, I think it's close. In any version of him, I think it's close. Although I think the later, less mobile Joe Louis is more vulnerable to Langford's, who was also less mobile, but hit like just even harder. Just it was harder for him to land them, but because he was bigger, he was heavier, he had more meat behind punches, and when he was a littler dude, he was famously hard hitting. So when he became when he was coming in around 195, 200, yeah, he's got a belly. That's planting his weight, you know. It's like he already had the architecture underneath this gigantic chest and shoulders. So even with a little extra on him, he could really sling. I mean, he wouldn't be the only chubby heavyweight who could sling. It's just that he also had this massive career leading up to his chubby heavyweight, you know, hundreds of fights basically leading up to it. We don't even know how many fights he had. I think the experience advantage of Langford, having fought like faster versions of that type of fighting, including Blackburn himself, down at lightweight, and then I think one of theirs was at welter. At least one of their fights at welter, because Langford was growing. He grew larger faster than Blackburn. So even though Blackburn fought up the weight when they were younger, Langford was very quickly growing because, you know, and he started very young. So maybe that was true of Blackburn in the part of his career we don't have. We don't have everything on him, fortunately. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and you know, shout out to the chat. We're gonna do a recap of these. I think we're actually gonna do a conglomerate recap of all the different matchups we've done. We'll find a way to treat it so that the comments aren't lost. But big shout out to you guys. I'll read them tomorrow when I'll probably rewatch the show. We're trying to get the audio set here, trying to get parity on our audio levels. But so feel free to tell us about that. But thanks for coming in. Shout out to Scrapbook Boxing and to Hardline Boxing Talk, the boxing librarian. Folks, go check those channels. Check out 86 Boxing for sure. This we're gonna call it because I'm about to go into work. You know, this has been a lot of fun. This is tough. I'm gonna have to give this even more thought, like the different variables. But I think maybe earlier in their career, Lewis would have an advantage. He was a naturally bigger guy, and he was phenomenally hard hitting. So the smaller version, before he was up over one. Well, no, I mean at 160 he fought McVeigh, who was terrifying and was destroying people, but he forced McVeigh on the back foot. And actually, the fight that McVeigh did get over him in Australia, that was contentious. The crowd didn't like it because Langford was leading. McVeigh was fighting on the retreat. So it was one of those. Yeah, it's tough. I don't think Lewis can go on the back foot smoothly enough to stay out of the way of the artillery. And his speed to power ratio was just off the charts. So I think overall he was just a slightly better fighter. He's certainly more adaptable. I think he would use that at his very best. But if they fought a 15-fight series like he did with McVeigh, yeah, I think Lewis would at least pick up a couple, maybe 3. Some draws. Langford maybe win 5 or 6. It's tough. All-time great stuff right here. Josh, I want to thank you so much for joining me. Thanks to everyone in the chat for joining us for this somewhat scattered show. We put this together last minute. We'll have more to come. I got a couple of days off after this, so hopefully we'll get another one in. Josh, I'll reach out in the back. And it's been really good. So have a fantastic day. Thanks for coming, Josh. Appreciate you sharing some of your time. All right, folks, take care.